1 week after the announcement, Jake's life had turned completely upside down. His solution to the infinite cascade problem was being studied by scientists across the galaxy. The Institute's communication systems were flooded with requests from universities and research centers wanting to understand the human methodology. Jake sat in what used to be Professor Zalthek's private office, but was now more like a meeting room for beings from dozens of different worlds. Alien scientists came and went at all hours, eager to discuss Jake's approach to physics. "Mr. Morrison," said Dr. Yelanara, a distinguished physicist from the Andromedan Academy, "your use of musical patterns to represent dimensional relationships is fascinating. How did you develop this technique?" Jake tried to explain for the 100th time. "I just listened to the math like it was music. Equations have rhythms, just like songs do. When I found the right rhythm, the solution became clear." Dr. Yelanara's tentacles writhed with excitement. "Remarkable. We have been treating mathematics as a rigid structure when perhaps it should be understood as an art form." Professor Zalthek watched these conversations with growing amazement. In 1 week, Jake had challenged more assumptions about intelligence and learning than the Institute had questioned in its entire 847-year history. "Professor," Jake said during a quiet moment, "I need to ask you something. Are you angry that a human solved your impossible problem?" Professor Zalthek's crystal skin flickered with what Jake now recognized as amusement. "Angry? Mr. Morrison, you have given me the greatest gift a teacher can receive." "What's that?" "You have shown me that I still have much to learn. For 340 years, I believed I understood the limits of intelligence. You have proven that there are no such limits, only different ways of thinking that we haven't discovered yet." The real changes began when Admiral Kate Sullivan arrived from Earth with a delegation of human scientists. They had come to discuss establishing a permanent exchange program between Earth's universities and the Galactic Academic Institute. "What Jake has accomplished here," Admiral Sullivan announced at a formal ceremony, "proves that humanity has something unique to contribute to galactic science. We propose a new kind of educational partnership." The ceremony was held in the Institute's largest auditorium. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy attended, either in person or through quantum communication links. Jake wore his best formal clothes and tried not to be nervous as he sat on the stage next to beings who had spent centuries advancing galactic science. Dr. Hank Tarr, the Institute's director, spoke first. "In my 500 years as an educator, I have never seen a single solution change our understanding of intelligence so dramatically. Mr. Morrison has not just solved a physics problem. He has opened a new field of study." The director announced that the Institute would immediately begin developing courses in human cognitive methodology. They would study how human intuition, creativity, and pattern recognition could enhance traditional scientific thinking. "We are also pleased to announce," Dr. Hank Tarr continued, "that Mr. Morrison has been awarded the Institute's highest honor, the Cosmic Understanding Award. This has been given to only 7 beings in our history." Jake walked to the podium on shaking legs as thousands of alien eyes watched him. The award was a beautiful crystal that seemed to contain swirling galaxies inside its structure. "I don't really have a speech prepared," Jake began, his voice echoing through the vast auditorium. "I just want to say that I couldn't have done this without everyone who believed that being different was okay." He thought about Ben, who had encouraged him to think like a human instead of trying to think like everyone else. He thought about Tommy, whose simple block towers had shown Jake the pattern he needed to see. He thought about his grandmother, who had taught him that some of the most important knowledge couldn't be found in textbooks. "I also want to thank Professor Zalthek," Jake continued. "Even when my methods seemed crazy, he let me keep trying. He showed me that real teachers don't just share what they know, they help students discover what they don't know yet." Professor Zalthek stood, and began the complex hand gesture that Valfari used to show deep respect. Within moments, beings throughout the auditorium were making their own species gestures of honor. The room filled with clicks, whistles, harmonies, and movements that created a symphony of appreciation. After the ceremony, Jake found himself surrounded by students from across the galaxy. They asked questions about human thinking methods and wanted to know how they could incorporate creativity into their own studies. Vel Kara, the Quinter student who had seemed so superior during those first days of class, approached Jake with genuine curiosity. "Morrison," she said in her musical voice, "I have spent my entire life believing that perfect logic was the highest form of intelligence. Your solution suggests that my species may have been incomplete in our thinking." "Not incomplete," Jake said. "Just different. Your logical thinking is amazing. It's something humans struggle with. Maybe the best science happens when we combine different types of thinking." Crixlon, the Nexary student, clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. "Perhaps intelligence is like a puzzle that requires pieces from many different minds to complete." Over the following months, the changes at the Institute were remarkable. Traditional courses began incorporating human-style creative exercises. Students were encouraged to draw pictures of their equations, to find musical patterns in their data, and to trust their intuitions as well as their calculations. Most surprisingly, the new methods worked. Problems that had been unsolved for decades suddenly yielded to approaches that combined logical rigor with creative insight. Students from all species began making discoveries that neither pure logic nor pure intuition could have achieved alone. Ben completed his xenobiology degree and decided to stay at the Institute to help develop the new human methodology courses. "Besides," he told Jake, "someone needs to keep you from getting too full of yourself." Professor Zalfek requested a permanent assignment as Jake's graduate advisor. "I have spent centuries teaching students what I thought I knew," he said. "Now I would like to learn what you can teach me." Jake's favorite change was the weekly video calls with Earth that had become part of his coursework. Students from across the galaxy would join the calls to ask questions of human scientists, artists, and even children. Tommy became a celebrity among alien physicists for his insights about natural patterns. "Uncle Jake," Tommy said during one call, "are you really famous now?" "A little bit," Jake laughed. "But the important thing is that everyone is learning, that different kinds of thinking are all valuable." "That's good," Tommy said seriously. "It would be boring if everyone thought exactly the same way." On a quiet evening 6 months after solving the cascade problem, Jake stood in the observatory dome looking out at the stars. The galaxy looked the same as it had when he first arrived, but everything else had changed. Ben joined him at the viewing window. "Any regrets about coming here?" Jake thought about the question. He remembered his first day when he had felt so small and inferior compared to his alien classmates. He remembered the weeks of struggle when everyone told him that human thinking was too primitive for advanced science. "No regrets," Jake said. "I learned something important here." "What's that?" "That being different isn't something to overcome. It's something to celebrate. The universe is big enough for all kinds of minds." Professor Zalfek approached them, carrying data tablets filled with new research proposals that combined human and alien thinking methods. "Mr. Morrison," the professor said, "I have a question that has been troubling me." "What's that, Professor?" "If one human student can revolutionize our understanding of physics, what might humanity accomplish when we truly learn to work together?" Jake smiled as he looked out at the stars. Somewhere among them was Earth, where humans were dreaming and creating, and solving problems in their own uniquely human ways. And now, for the first time in galactic history, the universe was paying attention. "I guess we'll find out," Jake said. In the months that followed, human students began arriving at the Institute in greater numbers. They brought with them new ways of thinking about old problems, fresh perspectives on ancient questions, and the uniquely human ability to find patterns in chaos. The galaxy would never be the same. And for the first time since joining the Galactic Federation, humanity had found its true role among the stars, not as the strongest or the fastest or the most logical species, but as the ones who could see connections that others missed, who could find music in mathematics and poetry in physics. They were the species that proved intelligence had no limits, only different forms waiting to be discovered. And in a small dorm room on Kepler Station, Jake Morrison sat at his desk working on his next impossible problem, surrounded by drawings and equations and musical notes that would have looked like chaos to his professors a year ago. But now they knew better. Now they understood that sometimes the most important breakthroughs came not from thinking harder, but from thinking differently. The universe was vast and full of mysteries, and humanity had finally found its place in helping to solve them, one impossible problem at a time. Professor Zalfek sat alone in his office late at night, surrounded by student submissions for the infinite cascade problem. The crystal walls of his office glowed softly with mathematical equations that floated in the air like glowing butterflies. Had been reviewing solutions for 3 days. 11 students had submitted traditional mathematical proofs, each one following the established methods taught at the Institute for centuries. They were all sophisticated attempts, showing deep understanding of advanced physics. Velkara's solution was particularly impressive, minus 200 pages of elegant calculations that approached the problem from 7 different mathematical angles. Crix Lon had submitted a proof so complex that it required quantum computers to verify each step. The Velkari group had combined their mental abilities to create a solution that no single mind could have conceived. All of them had made significant progress. All of them had failed to find the complete answer. Then there was Jake Morrison's submission. Professor Zalfek picked up the humans' papers for the 4th time that evening. The solution looked nothing like any academic work he had ever seen. Mathematical equations were mixed with musical notation. Diagrams that resembled art more than science filled the margins. On one page, Jake had drawn what appeared to be a tree whose branches somehow represented dimensional relationships. Primitive human thinking, Professor Zalfek muttered to himself, just as he had the first 3 times he reviewed the work. But something kept drawing him back to Jake's solution. There was a pattern in the apparent chaos, a rhythm that felt almost familiar. Against his better judgment, Professor Zalfek decided to input Jake's equations into the Institute's most powerful quantum computer. The computer hummed softly as it processed Jake's work. Professor Zalfek expected error messages or mathematical impossibilities. Instead, the computer began displaying results that made the professor's 4 hands tremble. The equations were not just correct, they were perfect. Jake's solution didn't just solve the infinite cascade problem. It revealed underlying patterns in 11-dimensional space that centuries of traditional mathematics had missed. The human had found relationships between dimensions that no one had ever imagined existed. Professor Zalfek ran the calculations. Again, certain there must be an error. The results were identical. Jake Morrison had achieved something that 12 of the galaxy's greatest minds had done before him, and he had done it in a way that revealed new truths about the universe itself. Impossible. Professor Zalfek whispered. The next morning, Jake sat in the Institute's dining hall, trying to eat breakfast. His stomach was twisted with nervousness, and the alien food tasted like cardboard. Around him, other students discussed their solutions and speculated about the results. I heard Professor Zalfek worked all night reviewing our submissions, Velkara said to her study group. Perhaps this year someone actually solved it. Crixlon clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. The probability is low. The problem has defeated superior minds than ours. A few tables away, Jake picked at his food and tried not to listen. Ben sat across from him, eating something that looked like purple soup. "Stop torturing yourself," Ben said. "You did your best. That's all anyone can ask." "My best might not be good enough," Jake replied. "What if Professor Zalthek is right? What if humans just aren't smart enough for this level of physics?" Before Ben could answer, the dining hall's communication system activated. Professor Zalthek's musical voice filled the room. "All students in advanced theoretical physics, please report to Lecture Hall 7 immediately. I will announce the results of the infinite cascade problem." Jake's heart began beating so fast he thought it might burst. Around him, the other students stood and began walking toward the lecture hall with confident expressions. They had submitted good work and knew it. Jake felt like he was walking to his own execution. Lecture Hall 7 was packed with students, faculty, and even some beings Jake didn't recognize. Probably important scientists who had come to see if anyone had actually solved the famous problem. Professor Zalthek stood at the front of the room, his crystal skin flickering with patterns that Jake had learned indicated deep emotion. The professor's 4 hands held a stack of papers, the student submissions. "Students," Professor Zalthek began, "I have spent 3 days reviewing your work on the infinite cascade problem. I must tell you that several submissions showed remarkable sophistication and mathematical elegance." He held up Velkara's thick solution. "Miss Velkara, your approach through quantum field harmonics was particularly impressive. Mr. Crixlon, your computational analysis pushed the boundaries of what I thought possible." Jake's heart sank. He was not mentioned. "However," Professor Zalthek continued, "only one submission has actually solved the problem." The room fell completely silent. Jake could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. "The solution I am about to discuss is unlike anything in our academic literature. It approaches the problem through methods that I initially dismissed as primitive and unscientific." Professor Zalthek's glowing eyes found Jake in the crowd. "Mr. Morrison, would you please come to the front of the room?" Jake felt like his legs had turned to water. This was it, the moment when Professor Zalthek would publicly explain how wrong Jake's approach had been. He stood on shaking legs and walked to the front of the room, aware that hundreds of alien eyes were watching his every step. "Mr. Morrison," Professor Zalthek said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Jake blinked in confusion. "Sir, I told you that your methods were primitive. I said that emotion and intuition had no place in advanced physics. I was wrong." Professor Zalthek held up Jake's solution. "Your work is not just correct, it is revolutionary." Jake's mind went blank. "It ... It is? You have solved the infinite cascade problem in a way that reveals new truths about dimensional physics. More than that, you have shown us that there are forms of intelligence we never considered." Professor Zalthek turned to address the stunned audience. "For centuries, we have believed that the highest form of thinking was pure logic divorced from emotion. We have assumed that advanced intelligence must suppress intuition and creativity." He gestured toward Jake. "This human has proven us wrong. His solution combines mathematical rigor with intuitive pattern recognition in ways that our traditional methods could never achieve." A faculty member in the front row raised a tentacle. "Professor Zalthek, are you saying that human thinking is superior to established academic methods?" "I am saying that different forms of intelligence offer different insights. We have been looking at the universe through only one lens. Humans see patterns that we cannot perceive, connections that our logical minds dismiss as impossible." Jake stood frozen as Professor Zalthek explained his solution to the crowd. The professor showed how Jake's musical and artistic notations actually represented mathematical relationships that traditional equations couldn't capture. He demonstrated how Jake's primitive intuitions had led to discoveries that pure logic had missed. The human approach treats mathematics as a living language rather than a dead calculation. Professor Zalthek said. This allows for insights that rigid logical thinking cannot achieve. During a break in the presentation, Professor Zalthek pulled Jake aside. Mr. Morrison, I must ask, did you receive help from Earth? Did you use some advanced human technology I am not aware of? Jake shook his head. No, sir. I just tried to think about the problem the way humans think about things. Like music, or stories, or the way nature works. Professor Zalthek's skin flickered with amazement. You solved one of the galaxy's most difficult problems by thinking about stories? In a way, yes, sir. I realized that the collapse wasn't just a mathematical event. It was like a cosmic story with themes and patterns. Once I understood the story the universe was trying to tell, the mathematics became clear. Professor Zalthek was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Morrison, I believe you have just taught this old professor more about intelligence than I learned in my previous 340 years of life. As news of Jake's achievement spread through the station, aliens from across the galaxy began requesting copies of his solution. Scientists who had studied the cascade problem for decades wanted to understand how a young human had succeeded where they had failed, but Jake barely heard any of it. He was thinking about Tommy and his block towers, about his grandmother's cooking wisdom, about all the humans throughout history who had solved problems by thinking in ways that seemed impossible to others. Maybe being human wasn't a limitation. After all, maybe it was exactly what the universe needed. 2 months into the semester, Jake had developed his own way of studying. While other students filled the library with the sound of rapid calculations and logical debates, Jake found quiet corners where he could think in his own human way. He had covered his desk with drawings that would have looked crazy to his alien classmates. Spirals represented dimensional folds. Wave patterns showed energy flows. Musical notation helped him understand the rhythm of mathematical equations. To Jake, it all made perfect sense, but the infinite cascade problem was still not solved. With only 1 month left before the deadline, Jake was beginning to worry. His approach felt right, but he couldn't find the final piece that would bring everything together. Every time he thought he was close to an answer, the mathematics would twist away from him like smoke. Ben watched his roommate work late into the nights. Jake's desk was covered with papers showing strange diagrams that mixed mathematical symbols with drawings of trees, rivers, and storms. Sometimes Jake would stare at his work for hours without writing anything down. You're going to make yourself sick, Ben said one evening as Jake rubbed his tired eyes. I'm so close, Jake replied. I can feel the pattern, but I can't see it clearly yet. It's like trying to remember a song when you can only hear one note. Maybe you need a break. When did you last get a good night's sleep? Jake couldn't remember. The past few weeks had blurred together in a haze of equations and coffee. But he couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close to understanding something important. Professor Zalthek had been watching Jake's progress with growing confusion. During office hours, he would examine Jake's work with his 4 hands, turning the papers this way and that as if trying to decode an alien language. Mr. Morrison, the professor said during one meeting, I must admit I do not understand your methods. These drawings and patterns, they bear no resemblance to any mathematical system I have encountered in 340 years of study. They help me see the relationships between different parts of the problem, Jake explained, like a map of how the mathematics connects to itself. Professor Zalthek's crystal skin flickered with what Jake had learned was a sign of deep thought. And you believe this artistic approach will lead you to a solution? I think it might show me something that pure calculation can't, Jake said. The professor was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Morrison, I have taught thousands of students from dozens of species. All successful physicists learn to suppress their primitive instincts and think with pure logic. What you are attempting goes against everything we know about advanced scientific thinking. Jake felt discouraged, but not defeated. Maybe that's exactly why it might work. As the deadline approached, Jake became more desperate. He had 48 hours left to submit his solution, and he still couldn't see the complete picture. The pieces of the puzzle were all there, but he couldn't figure out how they fit together. Other students had finished their attempts weeks ago. Vel Kara had submitted a 200-page mathematical proof that Professor Zolthek called elegant and sophisticated. Crixlon's solution filled several quantum storage devices with calculations so complex that only the Institute's most powerful computers could follow them. Jake's work looked nothing like theirs. His papers were covered with drawings and diagrams that looked more like abstract art than science. He had equations, but they were mixed in with musical notes, poetry, and sketches of natural patterns he remembered from Earth. With only 30 hours left, Jake was exhausted and ready to give up. He called his family on Earth, hoping to hear familiar voices that would make him feel less alone. His parents were supportive as always, telling him they were proud no matter what happened. But it was Tommy who said something that changed everything. "Uncle Jake," his nephew said during the video call, "are you still working on that space puzzle?" "Yeah, buddy. But I don't think I'm going to solve it." Tommy was playing with building blocks while they talked, creating towers and knocking them down. "When I can't figure out a puzzle, Grandma says I should stop trying so hard and just let my brain be quiet for a while." "That's good advice, Tommy. She says sometimes the answer comes when you're not looking for it. Like when you lose your keys and then find them when you're looking for something else." Tommy knocked down his tower of blocks and began building a new one. As Jake watched, his nephew created a spiral pattern with the blocks, building up and then letting them cascade down in a flowing motion. "Look, Uncle Jake. It's like a waterfall made of blocks." Jake stared at the screen as Tommy's blocks fell in their spiral pattern. Something clicked in his mind, a connection he'd been missing for months. "Tommy, can you do that again? The waterfall thing?" Tommy happily knocked down his blocks and rebuilt the spiral. As Jake watched the cascade of falling blocks, he saw something beautiful and simple that he had been looking for in all his complex equations. The blocks didn't fall randomly. They followed the spiral pattern Tommy had built, but they also created their own rhythm as they tumbled down. It was structured but natural, planned but free. "Tommy, you're a genius." Jake said. "I am?" Tommy grinned at the camera. After the call ended, Jake sat at his desk with a completely new understanding. He had been trying to force the 11-dimensional collapse to follow human patterns, but that wasn't right either. The collapse would follow its own natural rhythm. He just needed to find a way to hear that rhythm and write it down. Jake worked through the night with energy he hadn't felt in weeks. Instead of fighting against the mathematics, he let them flow like Tommy's blocks. Instead of trying to control every variable, he looked for the natural patterns that would emerge from the collapse itself. As the sun rose over Kepler Station, Jake realized he was looking at something no one had ever seen before. His solution wasn't just different from the traditional approaches, it revealed hidden patterns in the way space and time could fold together. The mathematics weren't just calculating what would happen during an 11-dimensional collapse. They were showing how the collapse could be beautiful, like a cosmic dance with its own music and rhythm. Jake's equations looked strange compared to his classmates' work. Where theirs were filled with rigid calculations and logical proofs, his solution flowed like a story. It had themes that repeated and developed, like a symphony or a poem. But when Jake checked his work using the Institute's quantum computers, the numbers were perfect. Not only did his solution solve the infinite cascade problem, but it also revealed new relationships between dimensions that no one had ever discovered. With 2 hours left before the deadline, Jake printed his solution. and walked to Professor Zolfik's office. His hands were shaking as he handed over the papers, covered with his strange mix of mathematics, music, and art. "This is your final submission, Mr. Morrison?" Professor Zolfik asked. "Yes, sir." The professor glanced at the first page, and his crystal skin flickered with confusion. "This is most unusual. I will review it with the other submissions." Jake walked back to his dorm, feeling empty and exhausted. He had given everything he had to the problem. Whether his human approach would be enough, he would find out soon. Ben was waiting in their room with a cup of coffee and a smile. "How do you feel?" Ben asked. Jake collapsed on his bed and stared at the ceiling. "Like I just tried to teach music to a computer. Either it's going to be brilliant, or everyone's going to think I've completely lost my mind." "Knowing you," Ben said, "it's probably both." Outside their window, the stars of the galaxy shone in the darkness. Somewhere among them was Earth, where Tommy was probably building new towers with his blocks, not knowing that he had helped his uncle see the universe in a completely new way. Jake closed his eyes and waited to find out if thinking like a human had been enough to solve the impossible. 3 weeks into the semester, Jake was struggling. Every day, he sat in Professor Zolfik's class and watched equations float across the holographic displays. The math was unlike anything he had learned on Earth. It twisted and curved in ways that hurt his brain to follow. The other students seemed to understand everything perfectly. Velkara could solve complex problems in her head while the professor was still explaining them. Krixlon's fingers moved like lightning as he wrote calculations that filled entire walls. The group of Velkari worked together like a single superbrain, finishing each other's thoughts and equations. Jake felt like he was drowning in numbers and symbols that made no sense. The key to understanding 11-dimensional space, Professor Zolfik explained during one lecture, is to approach it through pure logic. Emotion and intuition will only confuse you. You must think like the universe itself, cold, precise, mathematical. Jake wrote down every word, but he didn't understand how anyone could think without emotion or intuition. Those things were part of being human. Asking him not to use them was like asking him not to breathe. After class, Jake stayed behind to ask questions. Professor Zolfik looked at him with his glowing eyes, and Jake could see something like disappointment there. "Mr. Morrison," the professor said in his musical voice, "I have reviewed your homework assignments. Your mathematical foundation is adequate for a human. But this problem requires thinking beyond what your species is capable of." "I'm trying my best, Professor," Jake said. "I am sure you are. But perhaps you should consider changing to a different course, something more suited to human abilities. I believe there is an excellent program in interstellar agriculture." Jake felt his face burn with embarrassment and anger. "I'd like to keep trying, if that's okay." Professor Zolfik's crystal skin shimmered slightly. "As you wish, but do not expect miracles." That night, Jake sat in his room staring at his textbook. The pages were full of equations that looked like alien languages, which, he supposed, they were. Ben came in carrying a plate of food that smelled like flowers and tasted like chicken. "You look terrible," Ben said, sitting down on his own bed. "Let me guess, the cascade problem?" "I don't understand any of it," Jake said. Maybe the professor is right. Maybe humans just aren't smart enough for this level of physics. Ben frowned. "That's garbage, and you know it. Remember what Dr. Turner told you before you left Earth?" Jake smiled a little. Dr. Alex Turner had been his physics professor back home. He said that humans see patterns differently than other species, that our brains work in ways that can solve problems others can't. "Exactly," Ben said. "So maybe you're trying to solve this problem the wrong way. Maybe you need to solve it the human way." "What's the human way?" Ben shrugged. "I don't know. You're the physicist." But I do know that humans have been surprising everyone since we joined the Federation. We're not the strongest or the fastest or the smartest, but we keep figuring out things that should be impossible. Over the next few days, Jake tried a different approach. Instead of forcing himself to think like the alien students, he started thinking like a human. He stopped trying to follow the rigid mathematical methods Professor Zalfek taught and began looking for patterns that felt familiar. The infinite cascade problem was about what happened when 11-dimensional space collapsed into itself. The traditional approach was to map every possible pathway the collapse could take and calculate the energy at each step. It was like trying to count every grain of sand on a beach dot. But Jake started thinking about it differently. What if the collapse wasn't random? What if it followed some kind of pattern, like music or a story? He remembered his grandmother teaching him to cook when he was little. She never used recipes with exact measurements. Instead, she would say things like, "Add salt until it tastes right," or "Cook the onions until they smell like home." She followed patterns and instincts that couldn't be written down in a book. Jake began applying that same kind of thinking to the physics problem. Instead of trying to calculate every possible detail, he looked for the underlying rhythm of how space-time might collapse. He spent hours in the Institute's library, reading about chaos theory and complexity science, fields that other species found messy and imprecise. But to Jake, they felt like maps to understanding how complicated systems could have simple patterns hidden inside them. The other students noticed his strange approach. During study sessions, they would watch him draw weird diagrams that looked more like art than mathematics. Instead of filling pages with calculations, Jake would sketch spirals and waves and patterns that reminded him of things from Earth. Hurricanes, DNA helixes, the way crowds moved through city streets. What is the human doing? Jake overheard Velkara asking Crixlon in the library one day. "I believe he is drawing pictures," Crixlon replied, his insect-like head tilting in confusion. Perhaps this is how his species attempts to understand mathematics. Some of the students began to mock Jake's methods. They would point at his drawings and make the sounds their species made for laughter. A few tried to help by showing him the correct way to solve physics problems, but their methods felt alien and cold to Jake. Professor Zalfek called Jake to his office after noticing his unusual homework submissions. "Mr. Morrison," the professor said, "your recent work is concerning. These diagrams and patterns you draw, they are not mathematics. They are art, perhaps, but not science. I'm trying to find the pattern in how space-time collapses," Jake explained. "I think there might be a rhythm to it, like music or poetry." Professor Zalfek's forearms moved in. What Jake had learned was a gesture of disbelief. Music? Poetry? "Mr. Morrison, physics is not about feelings or creativity. It is about cold, hard facts. The universe does not care about human emotions. But what if understanding those emotions helps us understand the universe?" Jake asked. "That is impossible," Professor Zalfek said firmly. "Emotion clouds judgment. It leads to error. This is why humans have been so slow to develop advanced science. You let feelings interfere with logic." Jake left the professor's office feeling discouraged. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe he was just a primitive human trying to do something his brain wasn't built for. That evening, Jake video called his family on Earth. His parents asked how his studies were going, and he tried to sound positive. But his little nephew Tommy could tell something was wrong. "Uncle Jake, why do you look sad?" Tommy asked. "I'm working on a really hard problem, buddy. It's so complicated that nobody has solved it in 200 years. Tommy's eyes lit up with interest. "What kind of problem?" Jake tried to explain the cascade problem in simple terms. He talked about space folding up like origami and dimensions that nobody could see. That sounds like the maze in our backyard, Tommy said. Remember when we put a marble at the top and watched it roll through all the tunnels? It looked random, but it always ended up in the same place. Jake paused. The marble maze. He remembered building it with Tommy during his last visit home. They had created a complex path with twists and turns, but somehow the marble always found the fastest route to the bottom. Tommy, you might be onto something, Jake said slowly. After the call ended, Jake sat at his desk with a new idea forming in his mind. What if the 11-dimensional collapse was like Tommy's marble maze? What if all the complex mathematics were just different tunnels, but there was actually a simple path through them? He started working with renewed energy. Instead of trying to calculate every possible collapse pathway, he began looking for the simplest route the universe might take. He thought about how water always finds the easiest way downhill, and how lightning chooses the path of least resistance. Ben came back to the room late that night to find Jake surrounded by papers covered with drawings that looked like flowing rivers and spiraling galaxies. Found something? Ben asked. Maybe, Jake said. I think I've been making this too complicated. What if the universe is actually lazy? Lazy? Think about it. Everything in nature tries to use the least amount of energy possible. Water flows downhill. Hot things cool down. Even light takes the shortest path from one place to another. What if an 11-dimensional collapse follows the same rule? Ben looked at Jake's drawings and smiled. That's the most human thing I've ever heard. Only we would think the universe is lazy. Jake laughed for the first time in weeks. Maybe that's exactly what it takes to solve this problem. Thinking like a human instead of trying to think like everyone else. As Jake continued working through the night, he felt something shift in his understanding. The equations were still complex, but now they felt like they were telling a story, the story of how space and time might dance together as they collapsed into something new. For the first time since arriving at the Institute, Jake felt like he might actually have a chance. Jake Morrison stepped off the transport ship and stared at the massive space station floating before him. Kepler Station looked like a giant crystal spinning slowly in the darkness of space. Lights twinkled from thousands of windows, and ships of all shapes and sizes moved around it like busy insects. First time seeing the Galactic Academic Institute? Asked Lisa Parker, the human liaison officer who had come to meet him. She smiled at Jake's amazed expression. It's huge, Jake said. I knew it would be big, but this is incredible. Lisa laughed. Wait until you see the inside. The station has 17 different environmental zones for all the species that study here. Your dorm is in the Earth Standard section, but your classes will be all over the place. As they walked through the docking bay, Jake saw his first real aliens. A tall, thin creature with blue skin and 4 arms was talking to what looked like a walking tree. Near them, a group of beings that resembled giant insects clicked and buzzed at each other in their own language. Don't stare too much, Lisa whispered. You'll get used to it. Remember to them, you're the alien. Jake nodded and tried to act normal, but his heart was beating fast with excitement and nervousness. He was one of only 5 humans ever accepted into the Institute's advanced physics program. Back on Earth, he had been a good student, but here he would be competing with the smartest beings from across the galaxy. They took a transport tube that shot through the station at incredible speed. Through the clear walls, Jake could see different sections designed for different types of life. One area was filled with water for aquatic species. Another looked like a jungle with thick green plants everywhere. Your roommate is Ben Collins, Lisa said as they reached the human residential area. He's studying alien biology. Nice guy. He's been here for 6 months already, so he can show you around. Jake's room was small but comfortable. It had a bed, a desk, and a large window that looked out into space. Ben was waiting for him, a friendly guy with messy brown hair and a big smile. "Welcome to the zoo," Ben said, shaking Jake's hand. "That's what we call this place. Don't worry, you'll love it here. The food is weird, but the professors are amazing." The next morning, Jake made his way to his first class. The classroom was unlike anything on Earth. The ceiling was incredibly high, and the seats could adjust to fit different body types. Some students sat on regular chairs, others on platforms, and a few floated in special tanks filled with liquid. Professor Zalfek entered the room, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. The professor was tall and thin, with pale blue skin that seemed to shimmer like crystal. He had 4 arms and eyes that glowed softly in the dim light. When he spoke, his voice was deep and musical. "Welcome, students, to Advanced Theoretical Physics," Professor Zalfek said. "I see we have some new faces this semester." His glowing eyes found Jake in the crowd. "Ah, our human student. Jake Morrison from Earth, is it not? How interesting. Humans are known for their creative thinking, shall we say? Some of the other." Students made soft sounds that Jake thought might be laughter. He felt his face get hot with embarrassment. Professor Zalfek continued his introduction. "This semester, we will explore the deepest mysteries of space and time. You will learn about dimensions beyond the 3 you can see. You will study forces that can tear apart stars and create new worlds." A student with gray skin and huge black eyes raised her hand. "Professor, will we be attempting the infinite cascade problem this semester?" The room became very quiet. Professor Zalfek's expression grew serious. "Yes, Miss Melkara. The infinite cascade problem will be your final challenge." He turned to address the whole class. "Let me explain this to our newer students. The infinite cascade problem is a theoretical question about what happens when space-time collapses. In 11 dimensions." Jake felt lost already. 11 dimensions? He barely understood the 4 dimensions they had talked about in his Earth classes. "In the 847 years this institute has existed," Professor Zalfek continued, "only 12 beings have ever solved this problem completely. None in the past 200 years. It is considered one of the most difficult challenges in theoretical physics." A student that looked like a walking stick insect clicked his mouth parts together. "Professor, why do we attempt it if it's so difficult?" "Because, Mr. Crixlon, it teaches us about the limits of knowledge. Most of you will not solve it. That is expected. But the attempt will teach you more about physics than any textbook ever could." Jake looked around the room at his classmates. There was Velkara, a member of the Quinter species known for their perfect mathematical minds. Crixlon belonged to the Nexari, a race that could perform calculations faster than most computers. Near the back sat a group of Velkari who shared thoughts with each other through some kind of mental connection. All of these species were famous across the galaxy for their intelligence. Their planets had been building spaceships and solving complex problems for thousands of years. Earth had only joined the Galactic Federation 50 years ago, and humans were still considered newcomers who were good at fighting and feeling emotions. But not much else. "You have 1 full semester to work on the problem," Professor Zalfek announced. "You may work alone or in groups. You may use any resources available in the Institute's libraries. But the solution must be your own work." After class, Jake watched as the other students immediately began forming study groups. The Quinter clustered together, their large heads bobbing as they shared ideas in their whistling language. The Nexari began drawing complex diagrams in the air with their thin fingers. Jake stood alone, feeling very small and very human. A few students looked at him with what might have been pity or amusement. One of them, a tall creature with silver skin, walked over to him. "Human," the being said in careful, slow words. "You should not feel bad when you cannot solve the problem. Your species is young. Perhaps you will learn something anyway. Jake felt anger rise in his chest, but he pushed it down. Thank you, he said politely. I'll do my best. As Jake walked back to his dorm, he thought about the challenge ahead. The infinite cascade problem. 11 dimensions. Space-time collapse. The words felt heavy and impossible in his mind. Ben was in their room when Jake returned, studying what looked like a plant that moved on its own. How was your first day? Ben asked, looking up from his notes. Confusing, Jake said. He told Ben about the class and the impossible problem. Ben whistled softly. The infinite cascade problem? I've heard about that. It's like the holy grail of physics here. You know what, though? I bet you'll surprise them. Why would you think that? Jake asked. Because you're human, Ben said with a grin. We don't think like anyone else in the galaxy. That's got to count for something, right? Jake looked out his window at the stars beyond the station. Somewhere out there was Earth, where his family was probably asleep. He thought about his nephew Tommy, who always asked him to explain how things worked. Tommy never cared if something was supposed to be impossible. He just wanted to understand. Maybe Ben was right. Maybe being human was more important than Jake realized. But as he opened his textbook and looked at the complex equations inside, he wondered if being different would be enough.